The knock came at exactly 11:47 p.m. At first, I ignored it. Nobody knocked on apartment doors that late, especially not in my building. I was sitting on my couch, half watching a basketball game while finishing takeout that had already gone cold. Then the knocking came again. Three soft knocks, not loud, not urgent. Almost hesitant, I stood up and walked toward the door. When I opened it, Sophie Carter was standing there, my neighbor, apartment 4B, the woman who had lived across the hall for nearly 2 years, the woman I had spoken to maybe 20 times. She held two suitcases, her eyes were red, her mascara had slightly run, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked completely lost. Sophie? She tried to smile. It didn't work. Hi. I looked at the suitcases, then back at her. Are you okay? She took a deep breath. No. The hallway was silent. Rain hit the windows at the end of the corridor. The entire building seemed to sleep. I stepped aside. Come in. She entered slowly, still holding both suitcases, as if she wasn't sure she should actually be there. I closed the door. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly said, I'm sorry. For what? For showing up like this. I shook my head. What happened? She looked down at the floor. My fiancé. The fiancé. I had seen him several times, tall, expensive car. Always in a hurry. They were supposed to get married in 3 months, at least according to the invitations hanging on her refrigerator. What happened? She swallowed. He left. I stared at her. What? She nodded. He packed his things this morning. I didn't know what to say. She laughed softly, not because something was funny, because she was exhausted. I think apartment suddenly he didn't want the very quiet. I looked at the suitcases. Where are you staying? She became quiet. That silence answered the question. You don't know. She shook her head. My sister lives out of state. My parents are traveling. I didn't want a hotel. I nodded slowly because now I understood. She wasn't here because we were close. We weren't. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. She looked at me. Her eyes were filled with embarrassment and fear. Then she quietly asked, Can I stay here until tomorrow? The question hung between us. One night, that's all she was asking. One night in the guest room. One night until she figured things out. I looked at the woman standing in my living room, the woman who always smiled in the hallway, the woman who watered plants when I traveled, the woman who suddenly looked completely alone. Saying no never even crossed my mind. Of course. Her shoulders relaxed. She closed her eyes for a second, as if she had been holding her breath. Thank you. I picked up one of the suitcases. She looked surprised. You don't have to. I know. I carried the bag toward the guest room. She followed quietly. When she stepped inside, she looked around. The room was simple, bed, lamp, window. Nothing special, yet somehow she looked emotional. This is perfect. I smiled. It's only for one night. She looked at me. And for just a second, something passed through her eyes, sadness, relief, maybe both. Then she quietly said, I hope so. The next morning, I woke up and completely forgot Sophie was in my apartment. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I heard movement in the kitchen, cabinet doors, the coffee machine's soft footsteps. I walked out and found Sophie standing beside the counter wearing an oversized gray sweater. Her hair was tied back. She looked tired, but somehow calmer than the night before. She immediately looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I couldn't sleep. I shook my head. It's your apartment, too. The words slipped out before I realized what I had said. She smiled slightly. Temporary apartment. Right. She handed me a cup of coffee. You remembered how I drink it? She looked surprised. You drink it every morning in the hallway. I laughed. And you noticed that? She shrugged. We've been neighbors for 2 years. That was true. For 2 years we had shared elevators, collected each other's packages, complained about noisy neighbors. Yet somehow we knew very little about each other. Until now, we sat quietly at the kitchen table. Rain still covered the windows. The city outside looked gray and cold. Sophie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked exhausted. I finally asked the question, Do you want to talk about it? She stared at the coffee for several seconds. Then she nodded. We were together for 5 years. I listened. He got a new job 6 months ago. She looked down. Everything changed after that. How? He stopped coming home. Her voice remained calm, almost too calm. He stopped talking. He stopped planning the wedding. I didn't interrupt. Because sometimes people don't need answers, they just need someone to stay. Sophie laughed softly. Last night he told me he wasn't sure he wanted this life anymore. I looked at her, and then he left? She nodded. He packed 2 bags and walked out. The apartment became quiet again. I couldn't imagine spending 5 years building a future with someone and watching it disappear in one evening. She looked toward the guest room. I didn't know where to go. You could have called your family. She smiled sadly. I didn't want to explain everything. I understood. Because sometimes losing someone hurts, but explaining the loss hurts even more. After breakfast, Sophie stood near the front door. She looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. I'll find a hotel today. I frowned. You don't have to. She looked surprised. Ethan, stay a few days. She immediately shook her head. I can't do that, why? Because this isn't your problem. I looked at her, the woman who had spent the entire morning apologizing for existing, the woman who hadn't smiled once, the woman who clearly needed time. Maybe I don't mind helping. Her eyes softened. For the first time since arriving, she looked less afraid. You sure? I nodded. The guest room isn't going anywhere. She looked down, then quietly said, thank you. The silence returned. Only this time it felt different, not awkward, not uncomfortable. Just two people sitting inside an apartment while life slowly changed around them. And as Sophie carried her coffee back toward the guest room, I realized something. She had only been there one night, but somehow, the apartment already felt different. One night became 3 days. 3 days became a week. And somehow, Sophie was still living in my guest room. At first, both of us treated it like something temporary. She kept her suitcases packed. She apologized for everything. The coffee, the television, the dishes. Even breathing, apparently. By the fourth day, I finally said, you know you don't have to apologize every 5 minutes. She smiled. I know you literally apologized for using the toaster. The toaster seemed expensive. I laughed. It's from Walmart. For the first time since she arrived, she laughed too, a real laugh. And honestly, I realized how much I had missed hearing it, because before all of this, Sophie had always been the quiet neighbor. The woman carrying groceries, the woman saying good morning in the elevator, the woman I barely knew. Now she sat across from me every morning drinking coffee. And somehow that had started to feel normal. Saturday morning we went grocery shopping, not because we planned, it just happened. She was making a list. I grabbed my jacket. 20 minutes later, we were arguing about pasta brands. You always buy the expensive one. It tastes better. No, it doesn't. She smiled. You're wrong. People in the store smiled at us. One older woman even said, you two are adorable. Sophie immediately looked away. I pretended to examine her. Neither of us corrected her. That evening, we cooked dinner together. The apartment felt warmer. Livelier music played quietly from her phone. She sang badly, very badly. I informed her of this. She ignored me. At some point, she stopped and looked around. The kitchen, the living room, the soft light coming through the windows. She became quiet. What? She looked down. I forgot what normal feels like. The words hit harder than they should have because suddenly I realized how broken she had been when she arrived. The woman standing at my door with two suitcases. The woman who couldn't stop apologizing. She was slowly disappearing. And this version of Sophie, the smiling one, the laughing one, the woman singing terrible songs in my kitchen, felt like someone returning home. Later that night we watched a movie. Halfway through it, she fell asleep on the couch. Her head rested against the cushion. The blanket had slipped onto the floor. The television quietly played in the background. I could have woken her. Instead, I simply sat there, watching someone who finally looked peaceful. When she woke up, she looked embarrassed. Oh my God, I'm sorry. There it is again. What? The apologizing. She laughed. I'll work on it. She stood up and picked up the blanket. Then she looked toward the guest room, and for the first time all week, she seemed uncertain. Ethan? She looked nervous, very nervous. What if I'm still here next week? The apartment became quiet, because suddenly, neither of us seemed entirely sure we wanted her to leave. The second week felt different, not because anything important happened, but because everything suddenly became normal. Sophie's coffee mug stayed beside mine. Her shoes appeared near the front door. Her books slowly filled the coffee table. The guest room door remained open, and somehow neither of us talked about when she would leave. Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Sophie cooking pancakes. She looked up. Good morning. I stared. You cook? She smiled. I have many hidden talents. Apparently, she placed a plate in front of me. I took a bite, then immediately looked at her. Marry me, she laughed, too soon. The joke lasted only a second, but strangely, neither of us laughed afterward. Because lately, small moments had started feeling different. After breakfast, we cleaned the apartment together. Music played. She danced while holding a broom. Terribly, absolutely terribly. I informed her of this. She informed me that my dancing was worse, which, unfortunately, was true. Later that afternoon, we walked to a small grocery store nearby. People smiled at us. One cashier asked, how long have you two been together? Sophie nearly dropped the milk. We aren't. She stopped. The cashier smiled. You make a cute couple. Neither of us corrected him. Not because we wanted to lie, because suddenly the truth seemed complicated. On the way home, Sophie became quiet. What? She looked ahead. People assume things. They do. Does that bother you? I thought about it. Honestly, not really. Does it bother you? She looked down. I don't know. The apartment felt especially warm that evening. Rain fell outside. The city lights reflected against the windows. We ordered takeout, watched an old movie, and halfway through it, the electricity suddenly disappeared. The entire apartment became dark. Sophie's voice came from the couch. Please tell me you own candles. I think so. A few minutes later, we sat in the living room surrounded by candlelight. The rain outside became heavier. The apartment felt smaller, quieter. More personal, Sophie wrapped a blanket around herself. She looked around the room, the candles, the kitchen, the couch, the soft light, and then she quietly said, I haven't felt safe in a very long time. I looked at her. She wasn't talking about the apartment or the storm or even the breakup. She was talking about everything. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled, a very small smile. This place feels like home. The words stayed between us because suddenly the apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like ours. And honestly, that realization should have scared me. Instead, it felt surprisingly right. Later that night, as Sophie walked toward the guest room, she stopped at the doorway. She looked back at me. Her expression seemed uncertain, almost afraid. She quietly asked, Do you ever wish things could stay exactly like this? 1 week became 2. 2 weeks became a month, and before either of us realized it, 3 months had passed. Sophie's suitcases were gone, her clothes hung beside mine, her favorite coffee sat in the kitchen cabinet, and the guest room no longer looked temporary, it looked lived in. Strangely, neither of us had ever discussed it. There was no conversation, no decision. Life had simply happened. Saturday mornings became our grocery days. Friday nights became movie nights. Sunday mornings meant coffee on the balcony. The apartment had quietly created its own routines. And somewhere along the way, Sophie became part of all of them. One evening, we returned from dinner carrying takeout containers. Mrs. Parker, our elderly neighbor from downstairs, smiled at us. There you two are. Sophie smiled. Hi, Mrs. Parker. The woman looked at both of us. When's the wedding? Sophie nearly dropped the food. I almost choked. We aren't together, Sophie quickly said. Mrs. Parker smiled. Oh, sweetheart. What? I've been married 40 years. She pointed at us. You two look exactly the same. Neither of us said anything. Because honestly, we probably did. Later that night, Sophie sat quietly on the balcony. The city lights stretched below us. The air felt warm. I handed her a cup of coffee. She smiled. Thanks. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, Do people really think we're dating? I laughed. Apparently. She looked down at her coffee. And you don't mind? The truth surprised me. No. She looked at me. Why? I thought about it because 3 months earlier the answer would have been obvious. Now it wasn't. Because Sophie wasn't simply my neighbor anymore. She wasn't simply the woman staying in my guest room. She was the first person I spoke to every morning, the last person I spoke to every night, the person who made the apartment feel alive. I guess I've gotten used to you being here. She smiled softly. Me too. The silence between us felt different, not awkward, not uncomfortable, just honest. Then Sophie's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and immediately her smile disappeared. I noticed. Who is it? She locked the phone. No one. But I had already seen the name Daniel, her ex-fiancé, the man who had left, the man who hadn't called for months, the man who had suddenly returned. Sophie looked nervous, very nervous. She placed the phone on the table. It rang again. Neither of us moved. The city lights reflected in the window. The apartment suddenly felt much quieter. Finally, she whispered, I think he's coming back. And for the first time in 3 months, I realized I was afraid of losing her. Sophie didn't answer the phone, not that night. Not the next morning either. But Daniel kept calling once, twice, 5 times every time his name appeared on her screen. Something inside the apartment changed. The laughter disappeared, the easy conversations disappeared. Even Sophie seemed different, quieter, more distant. 3 days later, I came home from work and found her sitting alone on the balcony. She was holding her phone. She looked exhausted. He wants to meet. I stood beside her. What did you say? She looked down. I don't know. For a moment, neither of us spoke because honestly, I didn't know what I wanted her to say. Part of me wanted her to refuse. Another part of me felt guilty for thinking that Daniel had been part of her life for 5 years. I had only been part of these last 3 months. Eventually, I asked, Do you want to see him? She looked at the city lights. I don't know. The answer somehow hurt more than it should have. The next afternoon she met him. I told myself it didn't matter, that they needed closure, that she deserved answers. But when 6 o'clock arrived and the apartment was still empty, I realized something. I was jealous, actually jealous. I ordered dinner, didn't eat it, turned on the television, didn't watch it. The apartment felt strangely quiet without her, and for the first time in 3 months it no longer felt like home. The front door finally opened just after 9. Sophie walked inside slowly. She looked tired, very tired. How did it go? She placed her bag down. He wants another chance. The words hit harder than I expected. I nodded because I wasn't sure what else to do. She looked at me. Aren't you going to ask what I said? I looked away because honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. What did you say? She became quiet. I told him I needed time. The silence between us suddenly felt heavy, different. She sat on the couch. I remained standing. Finally, she looked at me. You're upset. I'm not, you are. I laughed softly. Apparently, I'm a terrible liar. She watched me carefully. Ethan, yeah? Her voice became very quiet. If I decide to leave, my chest tightened. What? She looked down. I don't want you to think these last 3 months didn't matter. The apartment became the possibility became real, the guest room, the coffee, the movies, the mornings, all of it could disappear. I finally sat beside her closer than usual. Sophie, she looked at me. I don't want you to leave. The words escaped before I could stop them. She stared at me, surprised, emotional, because I think both of us realized something at exactly the same moment. She hadn't become important to me. She already was. And for the first time since she knocked on my door 3 months earlier, both of us understood that leaving would hurt much more than staying. The apartment changed after Daniel came back. Not immediately, not dramatically. Just little things. Sophie spent more time in the guest room. She stopped singing while cooking. Nights became shorter. Coffee became quieter. And somehow the apartment that had felt so full for 3 months suddenly felt empty. One evening I came home and found Sophie sitting alone on the balcony. She was staring at the city. Her untouched coffee sat beside her. I sat down. You okay? She nodded, which usually meant no. The silence between us felt unfamiliar. Because for the first time since she moved in, we didn't know what to say. Finally asked, did he call again? She nodded. What did he say? He wants me to come home. The words hit harder than I expected. Because technically she never lived here. This apartment wasn't her home. The guest room wasn't hers. This was always temporary. At least that had been the plan. She looked down. He says people deserve second chances. I laughed softly. Maybe they do. She looked at me. Do you believe that? I didn't answer because honestly, I wasn't thinking about Daniel. I was thinking about mornings without her. The empty coffee mug, the quiet kitchen, the apartment returning to the way it used to be. And for the first time in years, I realized something. I didn't want to live alone anymore, not because I couldn't, because I didn't want to lose her. That night, we tried watching a movie, neither of us paid attention. Halfway through it, Sophie muted the television. Ethan? Yeah? She looked nervous, the same nervous expression she had the night she knocked on my door. I think I'm confusing everything. What do you mean? She looked down at her hands. 3 months ago, I lost my entire future. She took a deep breath. I remained quiet, because she needed to say this. You made breakfast. You listened. You never asked me to leave. Her voice became softer, and now I don't know if I stayed because I needed somewhere to live. She stopped. What? She looked directly at me. Or because I didn't want to leave you. The room suddenly felt very quiet. The city lights reflected through the windows. The television remained frozen on the screen. And for the first time, neither of us had anywhere to hide. I looked at Sophie, at the woman who arrived with 2 suitcases. The woman who had slowly become part of every day. The woman I was terrified of losing. She looked like she was about to cry. Ethan? Yeah? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. What if I leave and realize I left the wrong person? And suddenly, I realized I wasn't afraid of Daniel. I was afraid that I had waited too long to tell her how I felt. It started raining just after midnight. Heavy rain, the kind that hits the windows hard enough to wake you up. I walked into the kitchen for water and found Sophie sitting beside the window. The apartment was dark except for the small light above the stove. She held a cup of tea in both hands. She looked tired, not physically. Emotionally, she heard my footsteps. Couldn't sleep? I shook my head. You? She smiled softly. I've been asking myself questions all night. I sat across from her. Outside, the city lights blurred behind the rain. The apartment felt quiet. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie finally said, I met Daniel when I was 24. I listened. He was my entire future. She looked down at her tea. The wedding, the house, the plans. She laughed quietly. I thought I knew exactly how my life would look. I remained silent because this wasn't really about Daniel anymore, she continued. And then one day he left. The rain became heavier. She looked toward the guest room. The strange thing is, she smiled, I thought losing him would destroy me. I looked at her. But it didn't? She shook her head. No, her voice became softer. Because I walked across the hall, the words stayed between us. Because suddenly this conversation felt much bigger than both of us, she looked directly at me. You made coffee every morning. You listened to me talk. You sat beside me when I couldn't sleep. She laughed softly. You even let me take over your kitchen. I smiled. You're still terrible at singing. She laughed. That's fair. The tension eased, only for a moment because her eyes became emotional again. Ethan? Yeah? Her voice almost broke. I think I stayed for the wrong reason. My heart began to race. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. When I first came here, I needed a place to stay. She looked down. But somewhere along the way, she stopped. The rain filled the silence. I could hear my own heartbeat. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled with tears and honesty. You became my home. The apartment suddenly felt very small because for 3 months I had been afraid of losing her, afraid she would leave, afraid she would go back to Daniel, and now she was sitting across from me telling me the truth. Not about the apartment. Not about the guest room, about us. She wiped away a tear. I think I've been pretending that this was temporary. I couldn't speak because honestly, I'd been pretending too. Sophie stood up. She looked nervous, scared the same woman who knocked on my door with 2 suitcases. Only now she was asking a completely different question. She looked at me and quietly said, "Tell me I'm not the only one who feels this way." The apartment became completely silent. Rain continued hitting the windows, the city lights blurred outside, and Sophie stood in front of me waiting for an answer. Tell me I'm not the only one who feels this way. For several seconds, I couldn't speak, not because I didn't know the answer, because I had known it for weeks, maybe months. Maybe from the moment I realized the apartment no longer felt empty when she was there. Sophie looked terrified, not because she was afraid of rejection, because she was afraid of losing us. Losing the friendship we had built, losing the life we had accidentally created together. She looked down. "You don't have to say anything." I finally stood up. "Sophie." She looked at me. "I think I've been pretending too." Her eyes immediately filled with tears. The rain outside seemed louder now. The entire apartment felt smaller, warmer, safer. I took a deep breath. Because after 3 months, the truth deserved honesty. "When you first knocked on my door, I thought I was helping my neighbor." She smiled weakly. "I remember, but then you stayed." I looked around the apartment, the kitchen, the couch, the balcony, the guest room. Places that had slowly become ours. "You made coffee every morning. You made terrible pancakes." She laughed softly through her tears. "They were not terrible. They absolutely were." For the first time that night, both of us smiled. The fear slowly disappeared. Only honesty remained. I looked at her, at the woman who had arrived carrying 2 suitcases, at the woman who had somehow become the best part of my day, and finally I said, "I don't want you to leave." A tear rolled down her cheek. "What if Daniel calls again?" I shook my head. "What if he asks you to come back?" She never looked away, because suddenly the answer was easy. "I already know where I want to stay." The words settled quietly between us, because this was never about the apartment, or the guest room, or even the breakup. It was about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment. Sophie took a small step closer, then another. She looked nervous, the same way she looked on the night she knocked on my door. "Ethan." "Yeah?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I think I fell in love with you a long time before I realized it." My heart felt impossibly heavy because the truth was simple. So had I. I smiled. I think I did too. The rain outside slowly began to stop. The apartment remained quiet. But this time the silence wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with relief because after 3 months, after one broken engagement, after countless mornings, movies, and cups of coffee, neither of us was pretending anymore. And for the first time since Sophie arrived with 2 suitcases, we finally understood why she had stayed. The rain finally stopped, the apartment became quiet again. Neither of us moved. Sophie stood only a few feet away, tears still in her eyes. And for the first time in 3 months, there was nothing left to hide. No guest room, no temporary arrangement, no pretending. Just us. She laughed softly. "I spent 3 months trying to convince myself this wasn't happening." I smiled. "I spent 3 months pretending I wasn't jealous." She looked surprised. "You were jealous?" Daniel called. She nodded. "Fair point." For the first time all night, the tension disappeared. The fear disappeared too, because the truth had finally arrived. Sophie walked toward the window. The rain had washed the city clean. Lights reflected across the streets below. She wrapped her arms around herself. I was so scared. "Of what?" She looked at me. "That I would lose you." I walked closer. The distance between us suddenly felt very small. "You won't." Her eyes filled with tears again. "Promise?" I nodded. "I promise." For several seconds, neither of us spoke because after 3 months, words suddenly felt unnecessary. The apartment itself seemed different. The kitchen where we shared breakfast, the couch where she fell asleep, the balcony where we drank coffee, the guest rooms that was never supposed to be permanent, all of it had quietly become part of our story. Sophie looked toward the hallway. "You know something funny?" "What?" I never unpacked my second suitcase. I laughed, seriously. She nodded. I think part of me was waiting. Waiting for what? She looked directly at me for a reason to stay. My heart almost stopped, because the truth was simple. She had already become my reason too. The next morning sunlight filled the apartment. For the first time in months, neither of us had to pretend nothing had changed. Sophie made coffee. I made breakfast. Everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow everything felt completely different. She handed me my mug. "So what happens now?" I smiled. I guess we stop pretending you're my neighbor," she laughed. "And what am I now?" I looked at her, at the woman who knocked on my door carrying 2 suitcases, the woman who stayed one night, then 1 week, then 3 months. The woman who slowly became the best part of my life, and finally I answered, "Home." Tears appeared in her eyes one last time, not sadness, not fear, just happiness. Several weeks later, Mrs. Parker from downstairs saw us leaving together. She smiled. "Took you too long enough." Sophie laughed. Apparently everyone knew before we did. Sometimes people enter your life unexpectedly. Sometimes they arrive carrying suitcases, sometimes they ask for one night, and sometimes they stay long enough to change everything. Sophie knocked on my door because she needed a place to stay. She stayed because she needed time to heal. But somewhere between the coffee, the movies, the rainy nights, and the quiet mornings, we both found something neither of us expected. We found home. And the guest room that was supposed to last one night eventually became an office because Sophie never moved out. She simply walked across the hall one evening and finally came home.